Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Savannah Clement. I'm the Housing Policy and Planning Analyst here with the city, and I'm here to offer some brief introductions of our panelists this evening. And I just want to extend my gratitude to all of you for being here and doing this. You guys are amazing. Thank you. So first we have Al Wheel. Al Wheel comes to us from Wintrust Bank. He is the Senior Vice President of Commercial Real Estate for Wintrust. He's been in the housing finance game for about 30 plus years. And then we have Colette English Dixon. She's the Executive Director of the Marshall Bennett Institute for Real Estate at Roosevelt University. She also has about 30 years of experience in the real estate world, and so she is another expert. And then we have Mark Mueller. He works for Fulton Developers up in Highland Park. Mark has a ton of experience working with the Inclusionary Housing ordinance there and doing both market rate and with affordable housing in it. And then we have Tim Clont. Tim Clont comes from the Federal Home Loan Bank. He is the Vice President and Manager of Community Investment Programs. And he has also a wealth of experience from community organizations. He's worked for the city of Tempe and has done a lot of great affordable housing work. So these are our wonderful panelists, and they will be giving us a great education on housing finance tonight.
Thanks, Savannah. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Sorry, it is late. I keep forgetting what time it is. Good evening. And so I'm the moderator of this. I'm not really the key expert, but I want to get started by just setting a little bit of the stage about, what is really affordable housing as we're going to move forward in the discussion with Al, Mark, and Tim. So affordable housing, by its very nature, is not what most people assume it is. It's not public housing. It's not housing that's necessarily financed by low-income tax credits. The concept of affordable housing is saying that a household pays less than or equal to, not more than 30% of their income to cover their housing costs. And in many communities, there's a lot of discussion about how burdened people are with the increased costs of housing to what they're making income-wise. But for affordable, this is the threshold. And for many people who are used to renting in, any number of properties in the city and during their lives, that was always the big test when you went in to apply to rent an apartment, was whether or not your income really allowed it so that your rent was no more than 30%. So that's our threshold. In Cook County, of all households, overall, the median income is about $57,000 a year, which means that you can pay about $1,400 a month. And owner-occupied properties, of which 57% of the households in Cook County are owner-occupiers, the median income is about $80,000, which means that they can pay about $2,000 a month. And then for renters, $36,000 a year is the median income in Cook County, which means they can pay $900 a month. That's a really important number to keep in mind. In Evanston, which is a bit more financially advanced than the city of Chicago, Cook County in general, Evanston's a much more high-income community. The median income at $71,000 gets you almost $1,800 a month overall, what people can afford to pay. In the renter space, there's only a little bit more than $1,000 a month in order for a rental unit to be considered affordable. So is Chicago affordable? Is Cook County affordable? I would say maybe not. Look at what is affordable for a renter and the affordable median income at $900, but the cost is $1,000 overall. So generally in Cook County for renters, it is not an affordable market. The rental housing in Cook County, as of 2015, there were almost, more than 750,000 people who were considered renter households, or those actually renter households in total. That's actually more than 800,000 people. With a median income of $36,000, they can afford $900 a month. Their rent's $1,000. So more than 50%, at more than 50% of, or less than 50% of AMI, most households in the city of Chicago and Cook County are rent burdened at 85 to 90%. That's really crazy. A fact, most people don't think about this. 90% of rental housing in the U.S. is privately owned and privately financed. A lot of people think that there's a lot of rental housing that's publicly financed. That is not true. Most of it is privately financed. And 75% of low-cost rental housing is privately owned and privately financed, which I think is really important when you think about the sort of returns and the kind of capital that's involved in providing rental housing in this country. Most rental housing units are less than 50 units in a building. I know in Chicago we're used to high-rises. We're used to 100, 200, 300 units in a building. That is not really common around the country. And as I said, most of them tend to be privately owned, and they have lower rents than larger buildings because they're usually older. So here's the fundamental challenge. If rent on a market rate basis is $1,600 a month, and in an affordable unit, it's $850, if you take out the expenses, a market rate unit can deliver about $1,000 in net income to go for other things. It covers debt service, it covers maintenance, it covers all those other capital costs. In an affordable property, where the expenses are pretty much the same, there's not a lot of money available to maintain those units. And what you often find is that affordable units tend to be disadvantaged in their maintenance and in their location, because there is not a lot of incremental money available to operate them. So just wanted to set that general stage, just a mindset about affordable housing and how many people can actually afford it and how many people need it. I'm going to pass this over to Al for a second.
Thank you, and I apologize for the small print, but I hope everybody has their package and can read it a little bit more legibly. But what I really wanted to show here tonight was an example, and really more for discussion purposes than anything, is a developer looking at a affordable housing component within a 140-unit apartment building development. Okay, so if you look at the two categories, one, the headline is with affordable units and without. And typically on deals like this, the developer has an option to opt out, which means they can pay in the $100,000 per unit as part of their construction costs, or if they decide to include the affordable units within the development, then the market rents, there's a discrepancy in the market rents in the chunk price between paying in the $1.4 million in affordable and then putting the units actually online for rentals. So if we continue down the left side, the left column there, where we have the construction cost. So we have an acquisition cost purchase price of $7 million. Closing costs, DD is due diligence. That's some, maybe permitting, which is included in the soft costs, but just some backgrounds. The developer will have to do some discussions with the cities, municipalities, and then your hard construction contract is $20,700,000. Your hard cost contingency, and basically what that represents, it's about a 5% of your hard cost budget, and basically that covers any overruns in the construction, whether it be material, labor costs that are unforeseen, additional costs that you may incur that you weren't prepared to when you budgeted this out, i.e. a lot of it is infrastructure. When you start digging below grade, you see some soil and stuff that's just not conducive to building, so they have to put some shoring in. Some municipalities require detentions, water detention holdings. That adds a lot of engineering costs to some of these developments because the flow rate out of the detention pond has to be, it's mandated by the local municipality, but there's a lot of engineering costs that go into that. And then the soft costs are, legal fees and permitting and, architecture and maybe they had to do a study. So if we look at a total budget of $32,300,000, okay, at a price per square foot at $3.40, and I'm using a kind of a cap rate, which is kind of consistent with the market. In the multifamily sector right now, we're seeing in very vibrant communities, i.e. Wrigleyville, Lakeview, in the city of Chicago, where cap rates are sub 6%. They're 5%, 5.5%. I use 6% because it's kind of a nice round number and it's kind of a norm. So if you look at a net operating income of the net rentable square feet, okay? So you have net rentable square feet, which is where the renters live. The gross rentable square feet includes common areas, which does not produce any income, right? So it's your staircases, your hallways, and things like that. So with affordable units, okay, and at a price per square foot of $3.40 at a 6% cap rate, you have a valuation, again, once it's built out based upon that cash flow, of a $37,570,000 valuation of that completed asset. When you flip it over to the right-hand side of the column, all of the top numbers remain the same. So your land purchase price remains the same, your construction costs remain the same. The difference here is that the $1.4 million, okay? The $1.4 million is the buy-in that developer has to pay in order to not have affordable units included in the project. So when you add that $1.4 million into it, your total cost then goes up by $1.4 million, up to $33,700,000. Your price per square foot then is increased because you're taking the affordable units out, okay? So you're looking at and I used, again, a 40 cents per square foot differential. Some of them are greater than that. Some of them are less than that, just depending on the scope of the project, the size of the project. But assuming a 40 cents per square foot differential between, and this is a chunk price, so this is the average price of all of the units, at $3.80, your net income is $2,519,400, and implying that same 6% cap rate, because the cap rate's not going to change because the cap rate is driven by the local community. The locals, it's Evanston, it could be Chicago, it could be whatever, but cap rates are what other properties sell for within the neighborhood. So if you imply that same cap rate, you've got a valuation of just under $42 million, okay? So you look at the difference, it's $4.5 million. And that's what the developer has to look at when they look at the total scope of the project. One, their costs incrementally go up, right, with the affordable units, and the valuation is reduced. Without the affordable units, and you include them in your rentable square footage, the value of that property increases by $4.5 million. That's where we as a lender look at it, because lenders borrow on a loan-to-cost basis. So we look at the total project costs, and in the heyday, banks were lending at 90% loan-to-cost, right? Those days are long gone. So typically what we're seeing, a starting point is around 75% loan-to-cost, but that debt has to cash flow at whatever the bank's normal credit policy is, so the leverage may come down. So it may not be 75%, it may be 70%, it may be 65%, right? So it really is driven by the NOI, which is the net operating income. So if you look at below the example of a bank debt analysis, I'm using a 70% loan to cost there. So that's your bank loan at 70% is $22 million with affordable units, $23.5 million without. Your total project costs are the same. So if you look at year one net operating income, there's a $265,000 difference between with affordable units and without. Again, a sizable number. And if you look at the return of investment, which is an arbitrary number, but that's what developers look at, right? They need to look at a return of their investment because, one, it's their equity or investors' equity. Two, they're taking on all the risk because they have to get the project built, okay? So they're investors that are putting the capital up to buy into the project are expecting a rate of return on their money. And that rate of return can be anywhere from 6%. Preferred rates of return are about 8%. So when you factor those costs into what they have to pay the capital provider and what they have to pay the bank, they try to look for an average return of about 10 to 12% on a construction project. And if they get that and they sell at a 6% cap, that's where they make their money. So I'm just, again, I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how a bank looks at a construction project when there is an affordable component, because it really is. It's two completely different scenarios. It's whether the developer decides to buy in and pay it, or allow the affordable units on site. And there's a material difference. And this is only 140 units. Obviously, as deal sizes progress and get bigger, and cost of land gets bigger, and cost of labor gets bigger, and cost of material gets larger, these numbers get even bigger. So it's something that developers are very conscious of. And I think, the municipalities have to be cognizant of this as well. And I think a lot of them are, but we still run into situations where it just doesn't work.
Mark?
Oh, it's just here?
It's just here. There we go.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm a developer that has focused for the last 15 years in creating single-family and multifamily buildings, mostly within the North Shore. On several projects, we have incorporated inclusionary housing units in which a certain percentage of the units within a market rate development are affordable. What we have seen is in most markets that have high costs, there's very little affordable housing, but there is a great need for it. One of the great advantages that we see when we are providing affordable housing mixed up with market rate units in our projects is that it doesn't require public funding. So it's a benefit for the community without the need for public funding in the projects that we are doing. My experience with inclusionary housing is pretty much basically in Highland Park, in which it's a requirement to have 20% of the units need to be affordable when you have a project that has more than 5 units. There is an option to pay a fee in lieu of building affordable units, but that option is only available when you have projects that have less than 20 units. So if you're building more than 20 units, you have to include affordable units in the project together with market rate units. One of the reasons that I think the project works in Highland Park, or at least it's been working for us for many years, is because the city provides incentives for developers to help offset the costs of those affordable units. The biggest incentive or benefit that developers get are density bonuses, which means that if you are required to build a certain amount of affordable units, you get a density of the same amount of units on top of what you're allowed to do within the zoning district. You get a bonus of additional units. And on some cases, you even get a bonus unit. If you go through a planned unit development, you could get additional units as bonus units within the planned unit development. So it's trying to encourage better developments. Some other incentives that are offered to developers are demolition fees are waived, permit fees are waived, impact fees are waived for the affordable units in the project. And when you take into account the fact that you get bonus units, the ratio between affordable units in most projects is probably closer to 15% of the total units in the project. So potentially, if you're able to build more units in your project, you can, to a certain extent, offset the additional costs associated with affordable units. In order to build more units, you need a higher density. And in some cases, additional height, which is an area of concern for most communities and most of the neighbors that don't want more height, they don't want more density. So what we have tried to do on some of our projects, and this is one that I have the slide right now, which was completed in 2000, by the end of 2016. It's an apartment building in downtown Highland Park. We have tried to find ways to work with the community and the neighbors to try to minimize the impact of the additional density and height in some of these projects. On Laurel Apartments, for instance, which is the one we have on the slide, the zoning allowed for 3 stories. and we propose a 4-story building. In order to minimize the bulk and mass of the 4th floor, it will step back, and instead of having the appearance of a brick wall on the 4th floor, it provides the appearance of being part of a roof line and not an additional floor. Going from 3 stories to 4 stories appears to be insignificant when looking at buildings in Evanston. However, what we need to consider is that it's a 25% increase in height going from 3 to 4 stories, which is not minimal. This project in particular has 52 units, and there's 8 affordable units that are incorporated as part of together with the market rate units. The first phase was completed in 2016, and we have another building just east, which is under construction right now. This was another project which we completed in 2007, which, as far as I know, was one of the first projects in the North Shore that included the inclusionary housing provision at the time. And this is another project in Highland Park that we just got approved a few weeks ago, actually a month ago. And in this case, the zoning also allowed for 3 stories in height. And because we needed to find that we got that density, we had to put it somewhere. And we added a 4th floor, which cannot be seen because it's set back from the street and from the sides. So there's additional units which cannot be seen, and that was one way to a certain extent, to satisfy some of the concerns from the neighbors and the community that didn't want additional height. But they knew that this is a requirement in Highland Park to have those affordable units. So I think that if we can find a way to have more affordable units without public funding, it's great. It's a win-win for everyone. And everyone needs to a certain extent contribute, not only developers, landowners, the city, home buyers, tenants. It's an effort that everyone needs to do something to try to make it happen.
Thanks.
Thank you. So good evening. Again, my name is Tim Clont. I'm with the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, and I'm going to guess that we are probably one of the largest banks that many of you have never heard of, so I'm going to take just a moment to tell you who we are and why we exist. So the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, despite our name, we're not a federal agency, but we're not a retail bank. No one here has a checking account with us, but we are congressionally chartered along with 10 other home loan banks in the country, so there are 11. And the primary purpose of the home loan banks is to be a bank for banks. So we are member-owned. We have about 720 members. They're banks, credit unions, financial institutions, and insurance companies that are chartered in Illinois or Wisconsin. So most of our work is right here in Illinois or Wisconsin. One of the unique features of the Federal Home Loan Bank system is that each year, every home loan bank contributes 10% of its earnings to an affordable housing grant program. And if we took that 10% and added it up across the 11 home loan banks across the country, our grant making is the largest source of private grant dollars exclusively for affordable housing in the country. In fact, since we started our program, we have granted, or invested in, I should say, more than 100,000 units of affordable housing, including a few hundred right here in Evanston. Okay? So I always feel like I have to have that little commercial in the beginning because I introduce myself being from the Federal Home Loan Bank, but I would say I'm not necessarily a banker. I'm really a community developer who works at a bank, and I have the awesome responsibility and privilege of working in affordable housing. So with that, I want to just quickly revisit the slide that Colette shared earlier because I think it is really fundamental to understanding one of the challenges in financing affordable housing. This slide uses an example of a unit that in the market rate development would rent for $1,650 a month, right? That's pretty typical. But the affordable unit is going to rent for $850 a month because that's what's affordable to the individual who needs to live there. But in a perfect world, the market rate unit and the affordable unit really cost about the same to operate, right? Because they should be fundamentally, substantially similar housing. So it costs on average, let's say about $700 a month to operate a rental unit. I have to pay the taxes, I have to pay the insurance, trash removal, snow removal, things like that. On average, it's about $700 a month. So in the market rate development, the developer or the owner has about $1,000 a month per unit that they can redirect to another purpose. Maybe it's profit, but more often than not, it's some type of debt. The developer had to get a mortgage, and he or she can support a large mortgage because he or she is getting about $1,000 a month on this unit. But on the affordable side, I'm renting it for $850 a month. It's still costing me $600 to operate it. So now I only have $250 a month of available cash flow. So the amount of debt, the size of my mortgage that I can get on an affordable project is much smaller. Right, so I'm sure you've been part of conversations or have heard conversations where there's questions of why is there so much public money or so many grant dollars or why is there so much subsidy going to an affordable housing project? This is one of the fundamental reasons why. Okay? So with that, I suggest that there are really a few different ways that we can make housing affordable or we can subsidize housing. On one end, we can subsidize the development of it. Right, so the more grant dollars or low-cost money that we can invest in the development of it, theoretically that means that projects should be able to charge lower rents because they're going to have a smaller mortgage. Okay? But now there's also a way where we can subsidize the operations of the housing, or maybe we can even subsidize the individuals who need the housing. Sometimes, for the lowest income populations, we have to do all three. We have to subsidize the development, and we have to subsidize the operations, and maybe they even need some rental subsidy, right? Because there are some folks in our community with incomes that are that low. So on the development side, I could teach an entire class in development finance, but that's not for tonight. But to introduce some of the programs. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, you've probably heard that before. You have tax credit developments here in Evanston. They're very competitive credits, but it's a very popular multifamily affordable development program. There's also historic preservation tax credits if there's a historic property involved. And even in Illinois, we have the benefit of having something called the donation tax credit. You probably know the city of Evanston has access to some federal grant dollars, the HOME program, Community Development Block Grant. They can be used for affordable housing, but there's also a lot of competition for other uses for those grant dollars as well. Some communities have trust funds, again, the Federal Home Loan Bank's affordable housing program, and then, of course, going down into the rental and the operating subsidies. And really, just spending a moment on the rental subsidies, that first bullet, housing choice voucher, many of you might have heard the term Section 8. This person has a Section 8 certificate, right? We really don't use that term anymore, although I think it's still very commonplace. A Section 8 certificate is now known as a housing choice voucher. That's where you're income eligible. You're going to take your voucher, go into the private market, find a unit that has a reasonable rent. You're going to pay 30% of your income, and whoever issued that voucher, the Housing Authority of Cook County, the Chicago Housing Authority, whomever, is going to pay the difference. Okay? As your income goes up a little bit, maybe your share of the rent goes up, right? It's always 30%. But this voucher allows you to have some housing choice, and it allows to have access to affordable housing across your community. Within the last few years, there's a relatively new program called the Veteran Affairs Supportive Housing, where it's specific to veterans who need some rental subsidy and access to support services. But I mention those programs because, and I apologize, the font's a little small on the slide. I promise it'll look bigger on my screen at the desk. But for many years, the majority of affordable rental housing was really provided by either giving a household a housing choice voucher, or what used to be called Section 8, or the development of public housing. But it's only in the recent years that this low-income housing tax credit has really become the engine, the production engine for creating new affordable rental housing. So the tax credit program focuses on development, where the Section 8 or the Housing Choice Voucher really helps you access what already exists. So when we have more emphasis on the low-income housing tax credit, it should not be any surprise to us that there's more pressure on development, right? Because the developer, whether they're a for-profit or a nonprofit, they need to follow the money that allows them to do what they want or need to do. So when the majority of the resource today is now in this low-income housing tax credit, and you need to build something to get the tax credit, or buy and rehabilitate something to get the tax credit, that's where the pressure is going to be. But interestingly enough, in 2015, and this is the most recent data available, so you can see tax credit is most popular, right? But this is only a small piece of the federal housing subsidy, if you will. So in 2015, our government actually subsidized $190 billion in housing. $190 billion. But the majority of that actually went to homeowners. About 70% of that subsidy went to homeowners. Many of you probably own a home. Many of you probably write off your mortgage interest or your real estate taxes, or you sold a home and you were exempted from a capital gain, right? That's all a foregone income, if you will, to our government. So in 2015, here's just a little statistic to take home with you. 2015, if your household income was over $200,000, your share of federal housing subsidy, sort of your benefit, was about $6,000. If you are a household with an income of $20,000 or less, your share of federal housing subsidy was about $1,500. Right? So think about that. Opposite ends of the spectrum. Households with incomes below $20,000 getting a share of about $1,500 a year in subsidy. Households with incomes over $200,000 were getting over $6,000 in housing subsidy. And some would argue that this end of the spectrum is probably the population that needs the subsidy the least. Right? But I'm not here to offer opinion. I'm here to just report the facts. So we have this low-income housing tax credit. That's where most folks are. That's how most developers are developing affordable housing today. And without going into too much detail, if a developer is awarded these very competitive tax credits, they sell them and they turn them into money. And then that money helps build the project. Right before our last presidential election, on average, a developer could take one of these credits and sell it for about $1.05. Okay? That probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you other than to compare it to what it's worth today. That one credit today is worth about 91 cents. Okay? So somebody might say, well, 14 cents, a drop, maybe not that big of a deal. But what that equates to is, on average, there's $30,000 less per unit of subsidy or equity to help build it. Right? So there was a drop in tax credit pricing after the last election, and then there was a further drop in tax credit pricing after tax reform, because it sort of devalued this low-income housing tax credit. Right? I'm not here to offer an opinion on that, but rather really just factually, the devaluation of this low-income housing tax credit has resulted in $30,000 less of money available to build a single apartment. And when you're trying to build 50 of them at once or 100, this is a significant amount of money. And there aren't a lot of other sources that a developer then can tap into to fill that gap to make that housing affordable. So I'm going to show you at a very high level 2 development budgets of projects that we have invested in. Okay? In part because one of the things I want you to walk away with is that because it's going to be affordable housing does not necessarily mean it's any more affordable to build. Okay? The affordable project uses the same lumber that the market rate project does. We use the same concrete, we use the same labor, right? And we're buying the same piece of land that we're competing against a for-profit for. Okay? So building it is not necessarily any less expensive. What we're trying to do is make living in it less expensive. So with that, here's a budget of a 13-unit rental project. 13 units, $5.3 million. I cannot deny that this is a significant amount of money. Okay? But some of the things to look at here, not all of these sources are going to be familiar to you, and that's okay. But the one that I want to point out, $5.3 million project, item number 4 says first mortgage. The only debt this project could afford was a $300,000 mortgage. All of that other money there is what we call soft money, meaning the developer doesn't have to pay it back. Now, one might look at this and think, gosh, a $5.3 million project and all you could afford was a $300,000 mortgage? I hear you. This project cash flows generates $188 a month per unit. Okay? So not a lot of money. And that's because the rents that they're charging are somewhere between $200 and $1,000 a month, because that's the population they need to serve. That, when you're charging someone $200 a month for rent, and it still costs you $600 a month to operate it, right? That doesn't make good business sense for any of us. Okay? So there has to be some offsetting subsidy somewhere that helps provide housing for these people, for the populations that really need it the most. Okay? As an investor or a grantor in affordable housing, because line number 3, you'll see Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, we granted about $234,000 to this project. We always make sure that we are investing in projects that actually need our money. Okay? If this project was generating a lot of cash every month, we might look at it and say, you know what, you can have a larger mortgage, so you need less money from us. But similarly, what we don't want to do, what doesn't benefit any of us, is squeezing some of these housing developers, affordable housing developers, so thin that maybe they can get it built, but then 3 years later they can afford to keep the lights on. Right? So what we're trying to do is ensure the long-term financial feasibility of this affordable housing. So when we invest in housing, it actually goes in as a grant, and we say we don't expect a financial return on the investment, we expect a social return. So every time we put $1 in one of these projects, we get 15 years of quality affordable rental housing in return. My last slide, but it's similar looking, 50-unit project, right? So significantly larger, and a significantly more expensive project, almost $18 million. And on this one, you'll see this $18 million project could afford about a $1.5 million mortgage. That's number 4. The rest of these sources are what we would, again, call soft, or they're forgivable. Because this developer, if he or she is really going to serve the lowest income populations, who in this case are paying anywhere from $900 to $1,200 a month in rent, right? So that's not too far, that's not ridiculously affordable for a lot of people, right? It still requires all of this soft money to be able to subsidize the development operations of it. Okay. So there's your development finance crash course. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Colette.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate all of that. We have some questions that I was going to ask the panelists, but first, since we've been through all this, we've thrown a bunch of numbers at you, we've thrown a lot of concepts, wanted to just take a pause and see if anyone has a question from what they've just heard or seen. We basically befuddled you to the point where you just don't know what to say. Is what open to?
No, this is audience.
This is for the audience. For anyone here, if you have a question, for I guess staff or us or whomever, because we have some other questions that we can kind of continue the conversation with. Yes, sir.
Yeah, 95% of the housing is provided by private industry. What kinds of programs do you have for people who are trying to provide low-income housing but do not want to be involved in one of these million-dollar development? My neighborhood is being victimized by gentrification, and the older people in our neighborhood are trying to retain our buildings and yet keep the rents low. But it's very, very difficult to do that, to remain in Evanston. And I was wondering, which one of your programs would you recommend, or is there any policy that feels that people have the right to live in certain communities?
You might want to take a stab at that?
Well, I don't know if Savannah or Sarah, I'm not sure if you have a local rental rehab program with your home or CDBG dollars that you could mention?
Yes. Yes, we have our CDBG housing rehab program. That's for smaller owner-occupied 2 flats or smaller buildings that does provide assistance up to $50,000. We do have a new program called the Landlord Rehabilitation Assistance Program that provides it's half and half. The landlord has to pay half the cost of the repairing the unit, and the city pays the other half. And it's a forgivable loan over X amount of time, depending on how much the loan is. So we do have a couple of programs.
Was your question tied to retaining ownership or redevelopment?
Right, and also the qualifications. My understanding, if you make more than $24,000 a year, you can't qualify for one of these grants. And
Qualify for a grant to stay in your unit or to redo your unit?
to redo your unit and to make it and keep it at an affordable rate. And there hasn't been that much available. There's a waiting list, from my understanding, for that.
Excuse me, Sarah Flax. I'll try to provide a little more information on that. Household income varies by household size. So with CDBG, which is our major source of our housing rehab dollars, households occupying the property must have an income that doesn't exceed 80% of the area median, which for a family of 4 is approximately $79,000 right now. So it can go quite a bit higher than the very lowest incomes, and those are all actually on our website. But there are limited funds available. And yes, we do have a waiting list for the CDBG program. It is managed by our housing rehab specialist because that's about the only way we've been able to figure out how to comply with all the federal regulations.
Yes, sir. In the blue shirt in the back.
Tim, I'm addressing this question to you. If I understood your example correctly, you were saying that the Federal Home Loan Bank doesn't expect really a return on their investment other than to have affordable housing unit, say, for 15 years. My question is, what happens after that 15 years? I remember there used to be, and I'm going way back, the old 221 D3 and 236, and there were several in my neighborhood in Chicago that when they mature, the mortgage was paid off or they were sold, they were converted to private market housing.
Sure. So I did mention that when we invest our funds into an affordable housing project, we look at it as a social return. We're not necessarily expecting a financial return. Many of the projects that we invest in are developed by what we might call mission-driven developers. They are in the business of affordable housing development, of owning it and managing it, and making sure that it maintains its affordability in some type of perpetuity. It is not uncommon in our program if, let's say 15 years ago, we made a grant to a project so they could to help build it. That project reached the end of if it's 15-year, what we call retention period affordability. Many times that developer or that owner comes back to us for a second grant to help rehabilitate it because now it's 15 years old and it needs some rehab. Many of the groups that we work with aren't interested in selling it into the private market because, again, they're more mission driven. Now, there are some other financing sources like the low-income housing tax credit that often require an affordability of at least 30 years, if not longer. So depending on the funding source that goes into it, there should be some safeguards to ensure at least some long-term affordability, if not permanent affordability.
Actually, the guy in the purple shirt had his hand up first. Sure. Right there. No, right here.
No problem. I had a quick question for Al on the example that you showed. Could you describe again how you calculated the income for the development with affordable units versus without?
So if you look at, so if you're talking about the NOI number,
Right.
Yeah, so if you just take the price per square foot at $3.40, that's your total EGI, which is your effective gross income, okay? So $3.40 times 85,000, I think gets to that number, or pretty close to it. And then the other one is $3.80, and that's the, excuse me, let me turn the mic. That's the chunk price, the difference between having the affordable units online and having the affordable units paid for and not online, and all of the units paying market rent. So your net operating income goes up by $265,000 when you pay the $1.4 million into the project, as opposed to having the affordable units on site and online. And then the expense load we use is kind of typical. A 35% expense load is pretty consistent, because that's inclusive of, real estate taxes and utility taxes and insurance and, a vacancy factor and things like that.
And so when Mark talked about some cost offsets for developers, so in theory, in this example, the developer would need about a $1.4 million cost offset to have the same rate of return?
Approximately, that's pretty accurate. Yeah, if you take out that $1.4 million component, or you offset it with $1.4 million of additional income, they're going to balance each other out, so your return should be fairly consistent.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to ask Tim about your projects. Look to be, are they entirely affordable? Are they inclusionary with private developers? Like, we're talking about having private developers required with no public financing.
Right.
Can you add to their cash? I mean, can you also give grants to private developers who are doing inclusionary housing?
Sure, and actually I probably should have qualified that in that I was asked to speak specific to affordable. Much of what we invest in is exclusively affordable, but we're not limited to that. We actually can invest in what is called mixed income, which is exactly what you're trying to accomplish here. One of the challenges, so the short answer is yes. Many times those projects can be eligible in our program. We have a minimum threshold requirement of at least 20% affordable, though. So a developer would need to commit to more affordable than I believe what your current ordinance requires. But one of the challenges, a mixed income project, its financing structure looks so fundamentally different than 100% affordable. And what I've been showing you is 100% affordable. And many of these financing sources, if not all of them, are likely going to be unavailable to a developer who's doing primarily market rate. Okay, so I think I hope that many of us are here to learn about how do we get more affordable housing units in our community, right? There's a few different strategies. It could be, through the inclusionary ordinance. It could be by supporting 100% affordable, right? It's whatever's going to make most sense for that population, the neighborhood, and the community as a whole.
I would think that, Mark, really what you've been doing addresses very much right down the middle of the fairway of this question, which is the sort of capital stack that you put together for the purpose of providing inclusionary housing within a market rate space, which is what you've done at the 20% level in Highland Park. I guess it would be interesting to maybe share kind of what a capital stack might look like for, a project like what you're doing.
Right. When we do our projects, and they do have the inclusionary housing component. When we run our numbers before we get involved with a project, we usually exclude the land, and we allocate the value of the land to the market rate units. So that's our way to internally justify the fact that the market rate units are paying for the land when we buy it, and the affordable units were not. They have the land paid by the other units. But the main reason that we can make it work is when we get incentives from the city, such as the density bonuses, on certain cases, zoning relief. I think there could be many more things that could come in play, which are not happening right now. Maybe parking relief could be in certain areas that are close to public transportation, tax breaks that the city could provide. Those are not things that that are coming into play right now. But we are getting all the fees related to those units. Permit fees are being waived. So but the biggest component is that we are able to do more units than we could have done without the affordable units in the projects.
I think the challenge with the integration of some of the unique housing financial incentives or financial programs that are out there, mixing them with market rate, is the potentially higher commitment to the amount of affordable housing units that may make a project somewhat unaffordable or maybe difficult to finance. On the other side, when you put the two together, sometimes that's a little challenging, I think, which is why we wanted to talk about the idea that in a certain context, when you're talking just truly what is affordable, okay, and you just kind of set the base, the whole mindset is that a lot of affordable housing is privately financed. It is privately owned. There is a definite segment, such as the sort of financing that Tim's at the Federal Home Loan Bank and many mission-driven developers do, that use all the tools in the toolkit that are available from a lot of very mission-driven sources. But there are often a lot of strings that go with that sometimes don't work really well when you're trying to mix it all into one big project. So a lot of different ways to skin a cat, but some of them are far more brain damaging than others, right? Yes, sir.
I'm still not clear about the difference between projects that are primarily privately financed and those that are relying very heavily on public, I'll say quasi-public sources. There were a number of projects that were approved by our city council that were, as I understood, largely privately financed. They had the option to either opt out. They were required to deal with the inclusionary housing ordinance. But I'm wondering whether the funding in those cases, the rates of return are quite different, what they expect. And so that's where I think there's a huge gap between what might be feasible for the city of Evanston with using these tools where they're available, and then relying on developers who are saying, we don't qualify for this, or we don't want to accept the limitations that might be involved in getting some of these funds, and therefore we expect, because of the market rates of investment, we will have to pay we will have to generate a lot more profit out of our total housing than we would if we were getting this kind of subsidy. Is that a fairly adequate understanding of the difference?
I might want to say that they are completely separate projects. The ones that have 100% affordable units and require that whole funding process from so many different sources than market rate units that incorporate affordable units. When I'm looking at those numbers as a developer, if I were to get involved with that project, and if you look at the second line, those are not projects that are that appealing, and there's not a lot of people that want to get involved with a project of that scale, it's a lot of work to do that kind of project. So there are projects that you don't see that often. They require to have that sort of structure is a very complicated process to get all that funding. And from a developer's point of view, you're not able to provide a great return to your investors. So they are hard projects to come by, and they're completely different to the ones that we do, which are mixing the affordable units with the market rate units.
But your projects are not 100% affordable.
No, we haven't. We've never done one of those. We do inclusionary housing in our projects, and we don't have a single source of subsidy, of grant. There's zero. So the only resource that we try to rely is try to get some sort of incentive from the city on our project, from zoning, from height, from more units, from some fees that are waived. That's the only resource that we have as developers to try to make these projects viable.
I have several questions. So one of them is basically, if you're talking about an inclusionary housing ordinance, a buyout is easier than putting the units on site, right? Because it doesn't affect your cash flow. Is that correct?
I don't know if it's easier, but if you look at it, optically, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But developers don't like to write big checks because usually that requires more equity, and and equity is expensive if it's not coming out of their pocket. So
Right.
you have to look at the whole scope.
Right. Okay. So it still hits you in the bottom line, but it's
for sure.
not
Yes.
as long-term a cost, sort of. It doesn't affect the cash flow later on.
Well, that's an unknown, right?
Okay.
Because developers usually are in and out. They're
Right.
typically not the holders of the asset once it's stabilized. They take it to the market and then they sell it, and then it's somebody else's problem later on. So the developer usually is in it and out of it.
Okay. So then, in terms of the inclusionary housing ordinance, I mean, many of us are very interested in that because it's a way to sort of counter the exclusionary zoning that has been in place for so long. And so the idea of requiring the units on site is very attractive as opposed to even having an option for buying out. But the question of incentives, how to really make that workable. I mean, I think one of the things we're finding here in Evanston is that the developers are saying, in this particular location, in this particular market, doing AMIs of 50 and 60% isn't really financially feasible. They need to be higher AMIs in order to make the units on site feasible. So, one of my questions has to do with how big an impact does the AMI have? And in Highland Park, I think the AMIs are 80% and 100%, something like that. Would it be possible? What kinds of incentives would be needed to make it feasible to have units at 50%? We have people who are wanting to have units at 30%, and is that something? I guess part of my question is, what are inclusionary housing ordinances good for?
I just wanted to make a comment to the previous question in regards to the buyout, and I don't think it's always the best solution for developers to pay the fee in lieu of building affordable units. I think that when you consider, it depends on the project, it depends on the land value, it depends on the size amount of units. I think if you get certain incentives from the city, it could make sense to not pay anything and to build the units, and you're not going to make a profit on those units, but you're going to make a profit on the market rate units. And in regards to the inclusionary housing AMI, I think it's in Highland Park. It's divided in thirds. The bottom third needs to be up to 50%. The second third is between 51 and 80 AMI, and then you have the third, or 33.3%, is between 81 and 120% for rental housing. So you do have a higher AMI, and I think that's very good. And even though there's three brackets, I still think it needs to be more flexible, because in reality, when we get tenants into our buildings, they seem great candidates, and for some reason, they are slightly off the AMI ratio for the units we have available, and they need to be a specific size of household and a specific income for a specific amount of bedrooms. So there's too many components that we need to try to find the right match for a specific unit. So I think more flexibility in regards to the AMI ratios would be very helpful for the program to work better anywhere.
There was one there. But I think she was there and then it's over there.
So regarding your Highland Park projects, we are always confronted with how Highland Park has done things, and you must be the person they're referring to. So now that we have you here, tell us about your most successful project and how many units it was, how many affordable housing units you had in it, and how many how many families were placed, and what percentage of AMI were they?
This is the last one that we completed, which is a project with 52 units. And thanks for the comments about Highland Park. I feel to a certain extent we were the guinea pigs in 2007. I was one of those developers that was forced to, I didn't have an option. If I wanted to do a project there, that was a requirement. I couldn't buy out. It wasn't an option at the time. And now I'm a strong, I believe strongly in affordable housing. I think the projects work out great. One of the interesting things is that on the project that we're seeing right now, there's going to be 52 units, 8 affordable units. No one in the project knows if there's affordable units or not. People that live there don't know who has an affordable unit. The neighbors don't know. The residents don't know. The units are not identified. They look exactly the same from the street. These are local residents that have lived in Highland Park for many years. Maybe their situation financially has changed where they cannot afford any kind of rental. So it's a great benefit to have that close to where people live and where they want to stay, and they want to remain. Sometimes where the kids go to the schools, they want to stay in the schools. They don't want to move because their income changed.
So the building is complete and occupied?
Correct. And the AMI ratios, the average median income ratios, are the ones that I described, where there's 33% up to 50%, 33% between 51 and 80, and the other third between 81 and 120.
But there are 8 units, so...
So it's a small project,
yeah,
right?
Right. So it's 2, 2, and 2, or 3, 2, and what? My math isn't very good. All right, what about another one? Give us another one. How many? Well, I'm curious because it seems like there are hundreds and hundreds of units.
There's very few. There's very few buildings. I think that's one of the flaws with the system. There's very few of them.
Would you say 2 or 3 buildings? 4?
That's what we have. We have three more buildings, and
so I noticed the buildings that you showed us. The maximum height was 4 stories.
The maximum height was 3 stories, and we, for instance, on that one that we're going to start construction this summer, we were able to get a 4th floor, but you don't see it from the street.
All right, it looks like, okay.
So,
what is the square miles of Highland Park? Do you know
How big is the city?
I want to know what
Boundaries.
the geography of Highland Park. We're 8 square miles. We're landlocked here, and
Highland Park is too.
Yeah, Highland Park is too.
larger than that.
Probably not.
I'm not sure about the size. Maybe it's probably comparable. I think it has less population. I think Highland Park has about between 35 and 40,000, and Evanston has.
Oh, we have 75 plus.
Right, so
yeah.
it's half the size of Evanston.
So are you limited in height there?
You are limited in height, and it depends on the zoning district.
Well, I know, but what's the highest you can build for residential and the highest residential?
Probably 6 stories right now on the business, on the main street on Central Avenue.
Thank you.
Questions on that side? One on the far side, yeah.
Okay, I'll give it
Way
to you.
over,
Thanks.
and then, yeah. Trying to be fair.
This is about the Highland Park. I'm wondering, and you might know the answer to this, or staff might, what's the difference between, you talked about how the city provides incentives, density, demolition. How does that differ than how Evanston goes about it?
I don't think there's any, maybe that's something for the city to.
Because the reason I'm asking is because you make it seem pretty easy to successfully develop affordable housing. I assume you do it in other communities where there's not an IHO. You do development.
The projects that we've been involved with in the last 15 years have been only in Highland Park for multifamily projects.
Okay. So I'm just curious, because it does look pretty easy for you to feel like you're making the profit. How is it different? How is Evanston set up different?
Do you know the answer? Alderman Rainey's going to
Not if you have more than 20 years.
I'm going to take a political crack at that. I'm an alderman in the 8th Ward. I'm on the Planning and Development Committee. We hear all the results of all the Plan Commission, Zoning Board of Appeal cases, et cetera. I believe our staff and some aldermen probably would be very agreeable to allowing additional height or additional units, et cetera. However, our community is very conservative when it comes to additional height, additional units. That's where our problems come in terms of incentives for development.
Do you know, is the process different in Highland Park than it is in Evanston? How you go about these things? Because it seems, and I'm ignorant, so I'm completely ignorant, but it seems to me that when Dunman was talking, he said, okay, we can do this, it just seems like
Well, we have negotiations also. We have them also, but it very rarely gets to the point of being awarded the bonus.
If I may add, I don't think it's maybe if I said it's a simple process, I don't think it's a simple process in Highland Park. This one project that we just got approved, it took us over 1 year to get the approval. We had to send letters to over 200 neighbors. There was a previous developer that tried to do a few more units, and it took them 1 year, and they did not succeed. And that's when we got involved with the property, and we had meetings with 4 or 5 meetings where we had about 30 neighbors attend these meetings before going to the Planning Commission. We had about 4 or 5 meetings with the Plan Commission where the neighbors came, they provided their feedback. The project had to change for almost 1 year, making changes with the neighbors, meeting in front of the Plan and Design Commission, meeting with the neighbors, and eventually it went in front of City Council. But it wasn't an easy process, and on certain instances I had to go to people's homes to try to explain the project and to try to understand their concerns. So it's not a simple process, and I think that's one of the reasons that some developers want to take a shortcut and don't want to go through a 1 year process to try to get an approval. So I wouldn't say it's a simple process.
The lady in the back with the black, I think, was next.
Yeah, right there, right by the pole. Savannah, right there.
Betty, I think Betty.
Okay, you guys work it out.
Tim, okay, in looking at where you're talking about totally with subsidy, affordable housing, and the grants and things that you give through the Federal Home Loan Bank. The 50 unit of new construction, I see that in your handout, you didn't show a mortgage in there, but you did show that organization deferred their developer fees. correct?
So actually, if you line number 4 is what we call, it's a member of ours. So one of our member banks did provide a $1.5 million mortgage on this $18 million project.
So
there is a little bit
of the member bank gave the mortgage to the person.
To the developer,
To
yes.
the developer.
And then this developer, like in many affordable housing projects, we don't begrudge a developer from making a fair return or a profit on this project, right? Everything has to make economic sense whether you're a for or not for profit. Oftentimes in an affordable housing project, a developer might be eligible for this much developer fee, but the project can't afford to pay it all to that developer at once. And so many times the developer will, what we call, defer part of their fee to help finance the project. So in this case, the developer deferred almost $400,000 of their fee, and as that project is able to pay it back over 15 years, that's when the developer will continue to get paid. And many times, because you can see there's 6 different sources that went into this one project, right? And with the deferred fee being one of them, if that developer had not deferred their fee, this project may not have been built.
Yeah. Okay. I know we talk about the developer here, but one thing I think we should mention to the audience that we are talking about community housing development organization. Mm-hmm. Those people that are non-for-profit that are develop housing. At one time, Evanston had 5. They have 3 that's still on the books because they have projects that are still in the line. Mm-hmm. And stuff and everything. We do have a community developed organization that is here in Evanston, not based in Evanston. It is a community land trust out of Highland Park. Mm-hmm. And we did have our own community land trust started, and we did do a house where we did go through all of these, not all of them, we used about 3 of these funds to develop the house, the first permanently affordable house here in Evanston. And it is a challenge, mm-hmm. and it's hard. But when you talk to about, we did the inclusionary zoning, and there was a toolbox where they had density for height and stuff and everything, and it kind of didn't work. Most of the developers came in and felt for them it was better if they paid the fee in lieu. It happened during a time when the ordinance wasn't approved, the developer was going on, they was in the pipeline, and we didn't get any money for that, so we got a little behind. But that's okay, we still plugging along. So one thing that was interesting, that with the selling of the tax credit and the Illinois donation tax credit, that individuals can use that to help in terms of donating when they sell their house to a unit, to sell it at a lower rate, to donate part of the cost by lowering the price, and that's how they can get part of the Illinois donated credits.
I'm most familiar with the use of the it's actually called the Illinois Affordable Housing Tax Credit, commonly referred to as the donation tax credit, generally used in multifamily housing, where land or buildings are being sold at a discount or donation. The conveyor of that real estate gets some tax credit consideration for that, but many times once that tax credit is sold, that equity that's generated goes right back into the affordable housing project to help pay for it. I also want to mention that, because you did mention community housing development organizations, community development corporations, so CHODOs, CDCs. Last year, and it's been this way in recent years, the vast majority of rental housing that we invest in is led by a nonprofit. So these are examples of nonprofit housing developers, some of whom partner with for-profit developers to help build the nonprofit capacity, but more often than not, we are working directly with a nonprofit.
I have a couple of related questions, and I wasn't here for some of the presentation. I was actually listening to live stream in my car, so you may have answered elements of this, but I don't think it's sort of out of the ballpark completely. We have in our inclusionary housing ordinance an option if developers don't pay the fee in lieu, they're building affordable units, but somehow they want to tinker with the provisions, the express provisions of the IHO, that they can come up with an alternative equivalent proposal. I'm wondering if you have any advice or any thoughts, any input on how it is from a financial standpoint, because it, I should be interpreted as a financially equivalent proposal. What we would use to assess this. So, the standard figure that I've heard bandied about in terms of what it costs to build each unit, and I'm talking about private plan developments, which is what all we've had here in the past few years that are in the past year, is that it's $300K to build each of these units, which seems outlandish, but anyway, pardon me?
It actually might be low.
Okay. Okay. So when a developer says, we can't afford to build to include the 10% affordable units because, well, we can't get financing. I've heard that. I guess what I'm asking is, what is the metric per unit? If you if they're not going to build all 10%, what is it? What is the value of each affordable unit? And I heard some data about this on the way here, but I didn't get all of it, and it sounded, complicated. But is there something that you can tell us on what is a fair way to look at each affordable unit? What is the value? Because we're also told, we're told that each one is worth $300,000, but then on the flip side, we're told that, each affordable unit reduces the value of this building so that the loan to value, when we go to financing is skewed. It's too low for us to get financing if we do all these affordable units. So I'm extremely baffled as to how you take a unit of affordable housing and figure how you figure this.
I may be able to take a little bit of a stab at that. If you look at my example here and you look at the two valuations, okay, which is $37,570,000 with affordable units, and the valuation of, just call it $42 million without affordable units, and you divide that number by the number of units, okay, that's going to give you basically your number of what. So if you take my example and divide it by 140 units, that $37 million number, that's with affordable units, and then you take the $42 million divided by that same number of units, it's going to give you a kind of a price per unit, okay? It's not exact science, but it's going to give you an idea.
I'm just going to make a point. If you look at Tim's number of his development, just because you were talking about unit costs, if you divided that by the number of units, the unit cost is almost $360,000 in that particular example. So in the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, in the Evanston Inclusionary Housing Ordinance, nobody ever really believed the amount of the fee in lieu was never intended to be able to completely pay the cost of a unit. If that were to be put as the fee in lieu, the belief is that that would kill off development. I mean, you're just at the point where it wouldn't work. The premise of our inclusionary housing ordinance is that if developers put 10% of the units on site at the affordability levels, they were supposed to get a 10% bonus in height, 10% bonus in units, and other offsets. They get their building permit fees waived on the affordable units, and they get deferred on the market rate units until first temporary certificate of occupancy, which means they don't pay those costs until they're starting to generate income, and they get parking reductions. The challenge is the cost is not working to the point where they can put all 10% on site, and they are not being allowed, because they are not being allowed the bonuses. And this is what Alderman Rainey pointed out. In other words, if the equation, because there were a bunch of calculations done and formulas run to try to get to this 10% bonus and all that stuff, but if we don't allow them the height to get to that additional, then the project doesn't pencil. It doesn't give the returns. Okay?
My understanding of the way the inclusionary, how I read the ordinance is that the alternative equivalent of proposal is not supposed to be, it does not refer to fee in lieu.
No, it doesn't. No, they can actually, a developer can present any number of options, and then it is up to City Council to decide if they consider that.
Alternative equivalent proposal, equivalent then to what?
I think it means 80. I think what the legislative intent of that, in my mind, was, and this is my opinion based on our discussions, was instead of a tiered, like so many 50%, so many 30%, or so many 80%, so many 60%, maybe a developer will come to us and say, look, we want to put all of the units on site, but it's got to be between 60 and 80%. Or we want to put all the units on site, we'll do the whole tier thing, but they've all got to be one bedrooms or something like that. Not to vary radically from the, or to be excluded and, maybe put a playground in the backyard or something.
But it says it's supposed to be an eternal alternative equivalent proposal. That clause is in there. It's not just do whatever you want. That's what it's saying.
But it is up to council to determine if they feel it is an equivalent value or that they accept it. I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
Financially equivalent.
Well, let me give you an example. If you look at the project that was just approved last night, which is 176 units, I think, they're going to have 17 units, affordable units on site, but they are not at the 50 and 60% of area median income. They're at 50, 60, and 80. So they're not getting bonuses. They're not getting any of that stuff. But the cost to them of those affordable units, if you look at the loss of income over the 25 years and stuff like that, is over $3.4 million. So
How is that cost figured is what I'm asking. You're saying it was a loss to them.
no, that, but wait, that is, well, it's based on the revenue they don't get. That's what Al was showing you in a pro forma, because if you don't get the market rate revenue, then you can't pay the debt service and you can't provide the returns which the investors are looking for. Does that make sense? Let's move on to another question.
Just one more here. I think one more here.
Right, one more here. Someone who hasn't asked one?
Okay, I'm sort of new in this, and I'm learning a lot from all of you, so thank you. In terms of some quick look at this, I see the need for profit. I understand. I have an MBA. And I understand the need for profit. I also understand social good, and social good can allow for less money return as opposed to social return, as Tim discussed. There's one thing that we haven't tried in terms of what I see, and that's Tim's. I just took this 13-unit example, and I don't know if you have a picture of that or something, but 13 units, if we did with affordable housing credits, that would only be for the 300,000, that's an investment part, would only be 3 units of affordable housing. If we did with 300,000 from the affordable housing money that we have, and then maybe eventually find some donor that would help out or maybe some return, because I've read about some of these investments that can have a return that can come back and pay off the loan or the investment. Is it possible to consider something like this at the Smiley Brothers place that's vacating and having a lot that's open, that 13 units at a low height near a shopping center might actually work? And then in terms of height, I know the higher the buildings, the higher the rents. And we're paying one developer just recently got approval who also said that he's charging higher market rents because he can. And that makes the AMIs go up because then you're saying the units in the building cost more. So I think that right now, profit goes against what Evanston's trying to do in terms of the maximizing the number of affordable units, and it sounds like we need to go Tim's route. And I also like what you said in terms of Highland Park development, that you did swaps. Because when you swapped like some 20% down to 15%, you're not having a money value come in there translating what that net effect is. So. But I'm saying we need more social investment, not necessarily financial investment by itself.
I just want to pause really quick. We are just past our time. I want to be respectful to everybody's time, but I will give you guys an opportunity to answer this. And I don't know if there's any closing remarks or anything, but we'll just.
I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on the social investment side, because I actually am actively involved with a not-for-profit REIT that actually totally exists for the purpose of financing and the preservation of affordable and workforce housing around the country. That's what it does. And one of the interesting challenges with the social mission model, which is that it requires an incredibly intricate platform of capital sources, most of whom at some level are still looking for something back. I mean, you still wind up with social good is a great thing, and it's wonderful that we've got all of these other great tools, but at the end of the day, you still do not get to totally walk away from the concept of investment return on some level. And there's a great proliferation of institutional investment sources getting into impact investing for the purpose, many instances, of helping to support the development of a more affordable housing base in this country. The challenge that they're having is that they still are expecting return. They're not in the position to forego return to facilitate the social good. And not-for-profits that are still looking to get the social good, provide the not-for-profit mission, are usually in the position of still having to return some sort of return to somebody. So you can't totally reduce the expense exposure from that vehicle. So the hybrids tend to be floating up no matter however you get through it. And I think that the effort here to create different methodologies for trying to deliver this is really consistent with some of the challenges in the capital markets these days in trying to deliver quality housing in a broad range of affordability that allows for inclusionary environments and communities. And there are so many forces that get in the way that the sole collaborative engagement of unique funding sources, market rate, inclusionary, compromises, and bank facilitating is actually an imperative, combined with community capacity to help support flexibility. And at the end of the day, you can have all these other things. This is my opinion. This is my little soapbox on this issue. At the end of the day, you can have all of that, but if you don't have community capacity to be flexible and how you have to maybe make a few adjustments in order to accommodate the delivery of a product, you actually wind up just kind of talking to yourself, which is actually kind of an unfortunate outcome sometimes when the community is really struggling with some of the things that have to be considered to make change like this. So, we just wanted to bring some different perspectives. And, we are running time. We are getting a little late, and things are lots of interesting conversations. Can we take that one offline? Or do you want to take it up here? Go ahead.
That's a valuable question. Do you think the low-income housing tax credit at 91 cents versus $1.05 is still a viable program, and it's particularly in light of the new tax law?
I think, Tim, what do you think? I mean, I'm not sure it is, but it's a tool.
Big source of money that's gone then.
I know, it's a tool.
Well, I mean, perhaps, but I also, I happened to start my affordable housing career at the inception of the low-income housing tax credit program when it was selling for 60 cents. So, I mean, and it's been that low since, and it's been as high as, over $1. So I think it's still a very competitive and attractive capital source. It may not have the value that it did before the last election, but I also don't want to discount the value that 91 cents is. Of course, we all hope it doesn't go significantly lower, but there are still institutional investors that are buying these credits, like big banks that have Community Reinvestment Act obligations, other large for-profit corporations with perhaps a reduced tax liability, but still have some tax liability. So, if you look at the recent competitive round of the low-income housing tax credit program that was hosted by the Illinois Housing Development Authority, there was certainly not a lack of demand. So while the value has been sliding, we haven't really seen a fall off, I should say, in the demand for it.
Yeah. Cool. Just quickly, want to say thank you to Tim and to Mark and to Alan. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us. I hope it was useful.
Thank you.